The Greek participle is the facet of Greek grammar that tends to give beginning Greek students the most trouble overall. I will not pretend, therefore, that this is at all an easy facet of Greek grammar, quite the opposite. And so we want to be realistic, particularly about what students who are seeking to use Greek and use Hebrew in exegesis with the help of Bible software and the like will be able to do with Greek participles. And I will say at the outset that it is likely that students in a course like Encountering Scripture Beyond Translation at Ashland Seminary will be largely dependent upon grammatical aids when it comes to thinking about Greek participles, such as the volumes in the Baylor Handbook on the Greek New Testament, where it is a priority for each author to talk about participle usage and to point out those things that someone who has actually studied the Greek language with a view to reading Greek would have had to gain facility in, but not necessarily the person interested in using Greek. So, participles being rather complex, we should start with a brief review of what is familiar, namely how participles are used in English. We tend to use participles adverbially to lay out the circumstances under which a main action happens. And so that's the basis of these first examples, the point of which is really to stress the difference between active and passive participles. We have an active one, for example, baptizing, where the one who is the subject of the participle is doing the action to an object. And we have a passive participle, baptized, in which the subject of the participle is done to by someone else. So an active participle would be, while baptizing by the river, John was arrested. In this sentence, John is the baptizing one, and the participle is acting adverbially to describe an action that was happening concurrently with another action. This other action, the arrest, in fact interrupts the action denoted by the participle. We also have passive participles, such as in this example, baptized by John, Peter and Andrew went out to preach. In this example, we have a participle baptized that actually describes an action that happened to its subjects, namely Peter and Andrew. Peter and Andrew, who went out to preach, are also the ones who are the subject of the participle baptized. So, again, we have an adverbial use of a participle describing the circumstances under which, or perhaps in this case, the preceding action to the main action, going out to preach. In English, we can typically form participles in other voices and tenses, although we tend to rely on helping verbs, for example, forms of the verb to have, to accomplish this. So a perfect active participle would be having baptized. Having baptized by the river, John went on to another ministry. Or, I should just stick with the example that's in front of me because it's better. Having baptized many, John's reputation spread. In this instance, again, now a perfect participle, having baptized, is functioning again adverbially. In this case, we could surmise, giving us the cause of the main action, the spreading of John's reputation. We also have the perfect passive, having been baptized, So, for example, having been baptized by John, the tax collectors repented. Again, the perfect participle is giving us an action that is antecedent to the action of the main clause, and perhaps indeed causally related to it. Now, I should actually just skip to this slide and talk about adverbial participial clauses, because all the examples that we just looked at were adverbial participial clauses with their main sentence, with the main independent clause as well. When it's used as an adverb, the participle gives more information about the action of the main verb. We saw that in these simplistic examples. In the first example, it gives the circumstances of the action of the main verb. In the perfect active example, having baptized, it may give the cause of the main verb. But in all of these examples, it gives more information. Somehow it qualifies, it describes the action of the main verb in some fashion. We could look at the NRSV of Hebrews 11:13 for another example. These, the heroes of faith, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them, and having greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. The participles, the English participles in this sentence, having received, having seen and greeted, having acknowledged, all describe under what circumstances the main action happened. These all died. Or in Matthew chapter 3, verse 6, they were baptized by John in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Confessing is a participle that supplies information about the circumstances under which the people were being baptized by John. Now, another major set of uses of participles in English would be adjectival uses, creating adjectival participial clauses in which the participles now are not describing an action, not giving more information about an action in the sentence, but describing some noun or pronoun in the sentence. Thus, in Revelation 5:1, we read, I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll written on the inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. Written is a participle in English. Whoops, I just skipped one. Seated, written, and sealed are all participles in English. And the first one, seated, gives more information about the one in whose right hand there's a scroll. I saw in the right hand of the one a scroll. Well, which one? The one seated on a throne. So the participle seated is used to describe, to qualify, to specify the one. And then written is another participle, and it's describing a scroll. Tell me more about the scroll. What kind of scroll did you see? Or which scroll did you see? I saw a scroll written on the inside and the back, sealed with 7 seals. So the last participle there, sealed, also describes scroll. What we find here are verbal actions: to sit, to write, to seal, turned into a form that enables that verb now to function as an adjective. Now, participles, like other verbal forms in English, those would be infinitives and gerunds. Participles can take all the complements that a normal verb can take. For example, I walk. Well, that's not a very good one because it's intransitive. I teach. At least I try. So I teach, an action can have a direct object. I teach students. It can have an indirect object. I teach for the church. It can have adverbs. I teach regularly. It can have adverbial prepositional phrases. I teach in the classroom, which actually isn't true anymore, but it's all I can think of. Participles can also have any of these complements. Teaching. Teaching students, I fulfill my vocation. Teaching for the church, I fulfill my vocation. Teaching in a classroom, etc. So participles retain all those qualities of a verb that allow them to take adverbs, direct objects, indirect objects, and the like. Now, as we move from what is hopefully familiar, English participles and their usage, to the Greek participle, we will notice some basic similarities. Participles in Greek also retain the qualities that belong to them as verbs. Thus, Greek participles will also have tense. We will encounter present, aorist, future, present, aorist, and perfect, and very rarely a future participle in Greek. And participles also have voice. We'll encounter active participles, middle participles, and passive participles. But they also have all the qualities of a noun or an adjective, in that participles have gender, number, and case, just like a noun would, or more precisely, just as an adjective would. So they combine these elements, and each part of the participle is relevant to give us clues as to its meaning and usage and kind of its precise sense. We have been accustomed to thinking about tense in non-indicative verb forms in terms of aspect, the kind of action that is named by a particular participle. This does tend also to be true in regard to participles as a non-indicative verb form, but we do find that, practically speaking, one can often sense a temporal element still present in the tense, particularly in regard to the time of the main verb, kind of relative time. Still, aspect is predominant, and we should think about aspect first when we think about the tenses of participles, and only secondarily inquire as to the time, the relative time that might be implied between the action named by the participle and the action of the main verb. Thus, a present participle is primarily highlighting the fact that the action of the participle is in process, is unfolding, and we're meant to think about that action as in progress, as the scene is painted in that Greek sentence. With a perfect tense participle, we are meant to think about a completed action, generally with ongoing results. And, since the perfect tense does talk about completed action, it inherently does name an action that is prior to the action of the main verb. That just is unavoidable. The aorist, first and foremost, calls attention to the action, pure and simple. It's often convenient to think about an aorist participle as naming an action that is prior to the action of the main verb, but it's important to remember that this is not intrinsic to the aorist tense of the participle. So while that might be the sense, it might be the meaning, it is more a contribution of context to reading the sentence than a contribution of the mere fact that the author has chosen an aorist participle. There are future participles in the Greek New Testament, but they are few and far between. when they do occur, they always, again by their nature, refer to an action that will be subsequent to the time of the action of the main verb. Now, in English, we pretty much depend upon word order to clue us in as to who is doing or being done to the action of a participle. In Greek, one is not dependent on word order at all, but rather the gender, number, and case of the participle provides us with our best clue as to who, what noun or what pronoun out there in the sentence is also the subject of this participle. There are exceptions to that, of course, but students in this particular course don't need to be worried about that just yet. As in English, we will find that the Greek participle serves adjectival purposes, but it can also serve adverbial purposes. Generally, it is very clearly marked in Greek whether we should regard a participle as functioning adjectivally, that is to say, it is there in the sentence to give us more information about some noun or pronoun in the sentence, or when it's functioning adverbially, that is, the participle is there to tell us more about the action of, generally, the main verb in the sentence. An easy rule of thumb for students who are seeking to use Greek is that if the participle is accompanied by a definite article, the Greek word for the, in the same gender, number, and case as the participle itself, it will function adjectivally in one of two ways. It will either describe a noun or pronoun with which it agrees in the sentence in gender, number, and case, or it will stand in for a noun or a pronoun, just like an adjective can. And let me explain this with a hackneyed English example, but the film The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly uses three adjectives substantively. That is, we understand implicitly that the author is not referring to three abstract qualities, but referring to three groups of people, but doing so without using any nouns at all, but rather using adjectives to stand in for nouns, as it were. So we know that the good, the bad, and the ugly refers to the good people, the bad people, and the ugly people. At least I presume it does. I haven't watched the movie yet. Nevertheless, in Greek, the same thing can happen with adjectives, but it can also happen with participles. For example, the one sitting on the throne in Greek would simply be the definite article the with a participle. And that article the and the participle will both have the same gender, the same number, and the same case, showing that they go together. They form a unit together. And that will stand in for a noun. There'll be no noun or pronoun in the sentence, just an article and a participle. Nevertheless, if we have then a definite article with a participle, we know that we're looking at an adjectival use. If we have a participle without any definite article with it, accompanying it, marked by gender, number, and case agreement, then the chances are good, not 100%, but the chances are good that we have a participle that will function adverbially. That is to say, that particular participle will be giving more information about the circumstances or the how or the why or the manner of the action of the main verb in the sentence. So we could think a little bit more about adjectival participles. When a participle is going to describe a noun, it will agree with the noun and its article in gender, number, and case, and will be in a certain word order with that noun. One of these two patterns represented here, and they're both called attributive position patterns. That means that the participle is being presented as an attribute of the noun. What is unfortunate for the student who is simply trying to learn to use Greek rather than read Greek is that you would need to recognize, but it's very difficult to recognize, this pattern when there are other intervening words, as there might well be in any given Greek sentence. So it's a bit challenging. Again, this is though why I've supplied you with the grammatical handbook on Galatians, for example. So you have those discussions just laid out for you with every participle that you will encounter. So this will be worked out for you. Substantival use, again, when the participle itself stands in for a noun, not therefore necessarily the king seated upon a throne, in which case seated is a participle describing king, but simply the seated on the throne one. Really, in Greek, just the sitting on the throne. But the intent of the Greek is the one sitting on the throne. That is enough to point to a being, a noun, a person, place, or thing, as it were. Adverbial participles, as I mentioned, tend to appear without an article in front of them, and in a certain pattern called predicate position, but this is particularly difficult to discern for students using Greek rather than reading Greek, because the various components of this pattern can be separated by quite a few other words and therefore hard to see. But basically, when you see a participle that isn't accompanied by a definite article, there's a very good chance it is functioning adverbially. There's a small chance that it's functioning adjectivally and describing a noun that also doesn't have an article. But that is by far the rarer of these two possibilities. So in this instance, and again, grammatical handbooks will tell you this participle is functioning adverbially, usually in a specific way. When it's functioning adverbially, the participle describes some other verb in the sentence, providing information in the participial clause, in the action of the participial clause, about the when, the why, the how, or the means, or the manner, or the conditions under which the action of the main verb took place. Occasionally, the participle could even name the conditions in spite of which the other action took place. And so in a grammatical handbook, you might look at, you might see words like temporal participle, or a causal participle, or means, or manner, or attendant circumstances, or even concession, a concessive participle that says the main action happened in spite of the action of the participle. And again, we need to remember that with participles, we might need to think about both time and aspect, as we did in the indicative mood with verbs, but I will simply stress again that aspect will be the more will always prevail, will always be important with a participle, and may often be, in fact, the only facet of tense that is important with a given participle. The genitive absolute is a specialized construction which for now we can merely leave to grammatical handbooks, but essentially what it means is a participle and its subject will both appear in the genitive case as a way of showing that the two go together as subject and its participle, when the subject of that participle doesn't have a real role to play in the main clause. So it's a way of kind of setting the action off. So if I wanted to say in Greek, while the disciples were preparing the house, Jesus was out teaching. Well, the main clause would be Jesus was out teaching. The disciples have no role in the main clause. So in Greek, to talk about this action that was happening, so an adverbial participle would be used, talking about attendant circumstances or something. I would use disciples in the genitive case and preparing, the participle preparing in the genitive case, as a means of naming that action and laying it out, but also acknowledging that this doesn't have a part to play in the main clause per se. One not very frequent use, but not inconsequential use of participles is to form periphrastic tenses. That's a very arcane word to use, but just to put it out there, English verbs are largely periphrastic. We largely depend on a helping verb like is, are, was, were, and an actual form of the verb itself, like seated, sitting. So we will take a verb like is or have, and we will join it to a form of the actual action verb that we want to look at to form virtually our entire verb system. I was teaching. That's how we form the imperfect indicative. That's how we talk about action in progress in the past. The Greeks could do it with one word. We require 3. In regard to the verb itself, we require 2. We require a form of the verb to be and a participle, teaching. I have been baptized. That is a periphrastic form of a perfect passive indicative. Again, a Greek speaker could use one word to express that whole thought. We need 4, 3 of which represent the verb. Have, to get us into the perfect tense, been, to get us into the passive voice, and a passive participle, baptized. So the point of periphrastic tenses in Greek is that sometimes a Greek author will form a verb tense, just the way we tend to form most or many of our verb tenses, a form of the verb to be and a particular participle, to create, in effect, a more vivid equivalent of a standard indicative mood. We will not encounter these this week, but you could encounter this in just in Galatians, for example, several times. But a grammatical handbook will point out in discussing the participle that it's a periphrastic use and what tense it ends up being the equivalent of. This will hopefully help get you started thinking about participles, both in English and Greek. Of course, the readings for the week have more information and possibly a more helpful angle on this admittedly difficult grammatical animal. And because of the difficulty, you will have the benefit of a walkthrough of the first half of the assignment before you are tasked with doing anything, so you can have a little bit more help digesting the usage of subjunctives and the usage of participles before being asked to try out a few forms on your own, and then reviewing your work with a second walkthrough of the second half of the assignment to see where your instincts were good, were right, to see where you might have taken some missteps, and hopefully to understand what you missed, so that you'll be getting a better handle on this by the end of this current module.